Hello. I'd like to talk to you briefly about the concept of telehealth. As an informatics class, telecommunications and different ways that, we kind of talk and interact with our providers, especially in the anesthesia world or even primary care world. They're critical concepts. So, telehealth in itself, if you don't know, it's the delivery of healthcare services through digital platforms. This has pretty much revolutionized the way providers interact with patient care. There's a couple different types. There's synchronous and asynchronous. Synchronous telehealth, it's where there's real-time communication, face-to-face, video, or phone. Asynchronous telehealth, it involves an exchange of like recorded messages, data, images for later review. And the flexibility of asynchronous telehealth, it opens a lot of doors for different kinds of care. To where you're able to get a hold of your providers, during off hours and stuff like that, which is really nice. Telehealth really, it was kind of getting started, but the COVID pandemic really served as a catalyst for its adoption. This pushed healthcare systems to rapidly innovate and evolve. So during lockdowns, it became essentially a lifeline, which ensured continuity of care while minimizing exposure and risk to COVID. Um, Telehealth's capabilities during this were expanded significantly, totally reshaping the public's perception and paving a way for widespread integration. Because I know at least I was very telehealth before COVID. um, a handful of advantages. It includes things like increased access to healthcare, for instance. Especially for places like rural or underserved populations. There's also cost savings for both patients and providers, and improved convenience. Um, we don't really think about that, but there is a lot of cost savings there. If you don't necessarily have to have your brick and mortar fully staffed up, and providers can see patients from home, this is a huge benefit, especially for providers, um, at least in work-life balance. I know working from home definitely um, is something I personally enjoy. So, imagine a job where, you go into the operating room for 3 days and then you do pre-ops from home for 2 days. I think that's a pretty good gig. But as far as, other things, you have a lot of advantages, right? But some patients do, face difficulty navigating technologies, and providers, they may also struggle with forming kind of the therapeutic bonds that us as nurses we're known for. Um, from a compliance perspective, telehealth introduces a unique handful of considerations. Things like security protocols, such as HIPAA compliant platforms, these are essential to protect sensitive patient data. Additionally, APRNs like ourselves and nurse practitioners, they face barriers for practicing across state lines due to various licensing requirements. While some places that are compact states, um, to help address these issues, there's more universal solutions that are needed. Like I know personally for my psychiatric clinic that I own, when we do telehealth, if my patients are here in Georgia, but my provider lives in South Carolina, for instance, they don't need a South Carolina license, they need a Georgia license. So they can't use their South Carolina license to see my Georgia patients. They have to have the actual Georgia license. Just some basic hoops to jump through and all that. Um, Other things, there's a handful of ethical concerns. It involves, you look at things that like, can everybody access the data? What about patients without internet or devices? And digital literacy. These are big barriers to care. And the other thing is like with remote care, you must ensure that the diagnosis and treatments, they're not compromised by the absence of a physical examination. In terms of things like patient safety, telehealth has shown great promise in triaging and managing chronic conditions, but it's not a replacement for all forms of care. Um, when it comes to information like, I guess, health literacy, you know, it's hard because, there's handfuls of populations that just don't have access to internet, or they don't have access to high and fast internet. They don't, imagine, I guess grandma who's calling you trying to get, help with the remote and the VCR. Now you're asking her to log on to a patient portal. So you can see how some patients and populations might struggle when they're trying to embrace these new laws. There's other big things to kind of think about when it comes to information literacy is, having things like targeted education and simplified, interfaces for these programs are also really, really important. And it helps to maximize telehealth's reach and efficacy. Um, One of the other big things as far as access to critical care is, at the end of the day, the dollar seems to always kind of rule the roost. So you see a lot of decisions getting made on what's most cost efficacious. Telehealth, it operates in this evolving regulatory landscape where rules and safety standards and insurance reimbursement is frequently shifting on a dime. And every year they put out new rules that they might do or they might not do, and then everybody kind of lobbies one way or the other, and then we just see what happens. But that's not good to be able to perform on or a business on. Imagine if part of your business is mostly telehealth, or a lot of these primary care providers and all that. So it can really hit them, hard in a lot of changing ways. And these changes, they're often introduced by emerging technologies, rapid shifts in security protocols, or even just lessons learned by the broader adoption of these things. Like, for instance, I was talking about the COVID pandemic earlier, where we had to, evolve on a dime. But ensuring telehealth platforms meet stringent HIPAA requirements, it should be a critical focus to protect patient data. But when we're, like I said, we're rapidly evolving to this whole Web3 blockchain world, which should be helping these things and being able to assign smart contracts to put in these rules and regulatory issues will also ultimately, I feel, help in the long run. Other things to think about is insurance reimbursement as another area of just giant flux. Policies vary widely between public programs like Medicare and Medicaid, private insurance, and state regulations. So some insurers, they embraced these laws that require telehealth visits. They embraced them to be reimbursed at the 100% in the proper rate, whereas others didn't. And providers, they may face uncertainty about reimbursement eligibility. This creates, financial and logistical barriers for expanding telehealth services. So, why would you, I guess it's kind of like, why would you invest in oil if electric cars could be mandated down the road? And this is kind of the same thing here. If I have a primary care clinic, where I can handle 4 providers in my brick and mortar, but I can handle 15 on the telehealth side. It's very tempting to do that, and by doing that, I would be expanding access to patient care. But at the same time, what happens if the rules change on a dime, like they often do year over year, and I have to lay off half my workforce? Not only am I putting a bunch of people out of work, but at the same time, it's the end of the road for my business possibly. So you can see the hesitation with a lot of companies. So for patients, these kinds of shifting rules, they can directly impact the access for patient care. Limitations on reimbursing telehealth for out-of-state providers, for instance, they require specific platforms. They can also disproportionately affect rural and underserved areas. So consistency and clarity in these regulations and having the ability to project them into the future is something that's vital to ensuring telehealth remains a reliable option for all. And really, that's kind of where we kind of come in. A lot of these big concepts I talk about, it's important because us as the nurses really need to be the ones developing the AIs, developing the telehealths, developing that, and running for government, running for boards. Because if we're not the ones that are shaping these programs, I guarantee you the insurers, even though they should be thinking about the patients, they're probably looking at their bottom line. And who's actually protecting the patient? And that's our job as the anesthesia provider, as the APP, as the nurse, as the decent human beings that we are. We should be always out there working to expand access to patient care and serving these underserved populations. So when it comes to developing these things, if you want to go out there and punch a clock and go work in an OR, great. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, I hope a handful of you look into different, careers in nursing informatics or the development of these emerging technologies. Because, if we're not the ones making these rules, somebody else will be. And hopefully it won't be the wrong person. My one saying that I always kind of go back to is if you're not sitting at the table, you're on the menu. And I mean that when it comes to these things. So it is very, very important for us to kind of be out there and always advocating for our profession and our patients. Thanks everybody for playing along. I'll catch you here soon.